My boots sank into the damp earth. As I stood before the house, its sagging porch staring back like a skull with hollow eyes. The air was heavy, thick, with the scent of rotting leaves, and something sharper, like regret, soaked into the wood. I grew up on the northern edge of Ridgefield Valley, where my grandparents' home stood as a lone island in a sea of endless trees. As a child, I'd sit on the porch, wrapped in the illusion of safety, believing the dense forest was a fortress nothing could breach. My grandfather, with his weathered hands and sharp eyes, seemed to command the land itself, sensing every snapped twig or rustling leaf. His nod toward the woods felt like a pact with the unseen, a promise that nothing could touch us. But childhood illusions fade. After their deaths, grandfather first, then grandmother, the house stood abandoned, its windows dark, its walls sinking into silence. I avoided it for 15 years, dodging the memories, until legal papers forced my return last October. The drive was a descent into isolation, the road narrowing from asphalt to gravel, then to a rutted dirt path that seemed to resent my presence. Each jolt of the car mirrored the tightening in my chest, a warning I couldn't name. By the time I reached the clearing, the house loomed like a relic. Its boards warped its presence, heavy with unspoken history. The sun was bleeding into the horizon when I pulled into the clearing, my sedan creaking over the uneven ground. The porch sagged so low, it seemed to bow to the earth. One plank rotted through a jagged mouth, waiting to swallow my step. I hesitated, keys dangling in my hand, the silence pressing against my eardrums. The door's lock turned too easily, as if the house had been holding its breath for me. Inside, the air was a suffocating blend of old wood mothballs and a sour dampness that clung to my throat. Memories flooded in unbidden grandmother's humming in the kitchen, grandfather's boots by the door, the warmth of holidays long gone. I set my bag by the stairs, forcing myself to move. Opening cabinets to find dishes stacked behind yellowed paper newspapers, curling like dead leaves, and grandmother's knitting basket, its half-finished scarf frozen in time. The yarn was faded, but the needles gleamed as if she'd only just stepped away. I boxed the kitchen, then part of the living room, my hands moving mechanically. My phone flickered with no signal, a single bar teasing me before vanishing. By nightfall, I stood at the sink, eating a cold sandwich, staring into the tree line, a solid black wall that seemed to pulse with intent. Something out there was watching, and I couldn't shake the feeling it knew my name. I turned in early, the old clocks ticking, filling the void where modern distractions should have been. Lying on the sagging mattress, I stared at the ceiling. Every creak of the house amplified in the dark. Then it came a slow, deliberate scraping, clawing at the floorboards beneath me. My heart slammed against my ribs, each beat a hammer in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a possum, maybe rooting under the house. But the sound was too precise, too patient, like fingers tracing the wood's grain, searching for a way in. It paused, then pressed a dull thud, as if a hand tested the boards for weakness. I lay, frozen fists clutching the blankets, my mouth dry as ash. The scraping resumed, rhythmic, relentless circling beneath the floor. Each pause felt like a question, each thud an answer I didn't want to hear. I remembered grandfather's stories of the woods, how he'd pause mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the tree line as if answering an unseen call. The noises continued for what felt like hours, a cycle of scraping, pressing, waiting. When they stopped, the silence was worse heavy with anticipation. I didn't move until dawn's first light crept through the curtains, promising a fragile safety that felt like a lie. The next day, I forced myself to work packing boxes, avoiding the kitchen hatch that led to the crawl space. Each glance at it tightened a knot under my ribs, as if it might spring open to reveal something waiting. I checked the crawl space vents outside. Nothing disturbed, no tracks, no scratches. I told myself I'd imagined the sounds, that exhaustion had twisted my senses. But the house felt different now. Its walls no longer neutral, but watchful, complicit. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay under the blankets, eyes fixed on the ceiling, every nerve taut. Just after midnight, the scraping returned, louder, closer, clawing along the floorboards like it knew exactly where I lay. My pulse roared, my breath shallow and ragged. The sound paused, and in the silence, a voice emerged, low muffled, like words spoken through wet earth. It was unintelligible, a rasping whisper that seemed to crawl up from the house's bones. I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling, but the screen showed no signal. The scraping grew frantic, testing each plank, searching. Then, from below, the hatch creaked. It lifted slowly, a pale arm reaching through, streaked with dirt, its fingers clawing for purchase. I bolted, grabbing my bag, my feet slipping on the stairs, as I fled the image of that arm burning into my mind. I didn't think I ran. The hatch's creak followed me, a slow groan that promised pursuit. At the top of the stairs, I froze the front door, my only salvation. I shoved it open, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. The clearing was a blur of wet grass and shadow as I sprinted to the trees, my breath tearing at my throat. I pressed against an oak, its bark rough against my cheek, my heart pounding so loud I feared it would betray me. The phone in my hand was useless, its screen dark. Then the front door swung open behind me, footsteps descending the porch, deliberate, unhurried. They paused, then moved closer, as if sensing my hiding place. I held my breath. Every muscle locked the silence, a suffocating weight. The steps circled the clearing, wet and labored, stopping just out of sight. I imagined eyes without pupils, a face stretched too thin, searching for me. When dawn broke, I crept back, legs hollow, to find the hatch closed, the house silent. I grabbed what I could, left the rest, and drove until the trees vanished in my rear view. The house still waits in my dreams, its hatch cracked open, whispering my name. The air was wrong from the moment we turned onto that dirt road, a sour tang that clung to the back of my throat like damp rot. It wasn't just the smell of pine or the must of old leaves. It was something heavier, older, like the earth itself was exhaling a warning. I gripped the edge of Mason's truck seat, my knuckles pale as the tires crunched over gravel that seemed to shift under us, whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. Growing up in eastern Kentucky, I'd heard the stories about Fox Hollow, tales spun on back porches over sweating glasses of sweet tea, hunters who vanished their trucks found days later with doors flung open, keys still dangling in the ignition. My granddad used to say, the ridges out there didn't just hide people, they swallowed them. His eyes would drift to the tree line, distant and unreadable, like he was seeing something he'd never share. I was never one for ghost stories. But that morning, as Mason's truck rattled past a rusted gate, I felt a prickle crawl up my spine, sharp as a needle. Mason. My cousin was the opposite. He laughed at warnings, called them old wives' tales, meant to scare kids from sneaking into the woods. To him, Fox Hollow was just another blank spot on the map, a place to prove he could conquer the wild. He'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, obsessed with finding somewhere untouched, where the world felt raw and uncharted. No cell signal, no roads, just us and the trees. He'd said, his grin wide and reckless. I didn't want to look like a coward, not in front of him. We'd grown up competing racing bikes, climbing trees, daring each other to jump into the creek from the highest rock. Saying no to this trip felt like admitting I was still the kid who'd hesitated at the edge of that water heart pounding, while Mason plunged in without a second thought. The gate loomed ahead, its hinges sagging, the metal pitted with rust. Mason tapped the horn, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt out of place in the heavy silence. He climbed out, kicked the gate open, and the screech of metal on metal cut through the air like a warning. I stayed in the truck, my fingers tracing the worn edge of the seat, trying to shake the unease pooling in my gut. The forest beyond was dense. The trees packed so tight they seemed to lean inward, their branches knitting a ceiling that swallowed the sky. Mason climbed back in, oblivious to the weight of the place, and we rolled forward, the gravel giving way to a dirt path that barely deserved the name. The truck jolted over ruts, each bump jarring my thoughts, making it harder to ignore the stories I'd spent years dismissing. We parked in a patch of gravel that looked like it hadn't seen a vehicle in decades. The air hit me as I stepped out, musty, metallic, like the smell of a forgotten basement. I slung my pack over my shoulder, the straps digging into my skin, and followed Mason as he strode toward the trail. He moved with purpose, his boots kicking up dust, while I lagged behind, scanning the trees for something I couldn't name. The path was wide, at first an old service road with tire tracks, long since filled with rainwater and moss. Birds flickered through the branches, their movements quick and nervous, but no other hikers appeared. It was just us, the forest, and the weight of stories I couldn't quite shake. As we walked, Mason started talking, his voice loud in the stillness. He rambled about camping videos he'd watched, tricks for starting a fire without matches, ways to tie knots that could hold a bear. I nodded, half listening, my eyes drawn to the shadows between the trunks. Every so often, we passed relics of the past, stone chimneys, standing alone, their hearths choked with vines, piles of broken glass glinting in the dirt, a rusted stove half buried in honeysuckle. Each one felt like a marker, a reminder that people had lived here once, and something had driven them out. I wondered if they'd left by choice, or if the forest had made the decision for them. The deeper we went, the more the trail narrowed, the trees pressing closer until their branches brushed my arms. My skin felt tight, like it was trying to warn me of something my mind hadn't caught up to. Mason didn't notice. He kept walking, his pack bouncing against his back, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. I wanted to tell him to slow down, to listen, but the words stuck in my throat. What was I afraid of? A story, a feeling. I pushed the thought down, focused on the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of leaves under my boots. But the forest was watching us. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the way the shadows shifted just beyond my sight. By late afternoon, we reached a shallow creek, its water glinting over smooth stones. Mason stopped, dropped his pack, and declared this our camp for the night. He built a fire with a spark wheel he'd bought online, his movements practiced almost performative. I watched the flames catch their light, pushing back the encroaching dark, and tried to shake the sense that something was just beyond the tree line, waiting. My skin prickled, the hairs on my arms standing up, as if charged with static. I told myself it was just the chill of the evening, but deep down, I knew better. The forest wasn't empty. It was holding its breath, and we were the ones disturbing its silence. The fire crackled, casting jagged shadows that danced across the trees like restless spirits. Mason sat cross-legged, poking at the flames with a stick, his face lit with a boyish excitement that made me envious. He was in his element, untouched by the unease that had settled into my bones. I sat on a fallen log, my hands clasped tight to keep them from trembling, and tried to focus on the warmth of the fire. But the forest had other plans. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a message meant just for me, a warning I was too stubborn to heed. The trail we'd followed had already started to change its wide, reassuring path, shrinking into something barely wider than a deer track. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches tangling overhead, until the sky was just a memory. I kept thinking about the stories my granddad told, how the ridges out here didn't just hide people. They claimed them. He'd never explained what that meant, but the way he'd pause his eyes, fixed on some distant point, made me feel like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. I tried to push the thought away, to focus on the present, but it clung to me like damp cloth. Mason was still talking, his voice a steady drone against the quiet. He was recounting some survival hack he'd seen online, something about using pine sap as a makeshift bandage. I nodded, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire. The trees were so dense, they seemed to form a wall, their trunks blending into a single, unbroken shadow. I kept waiting for something to move, to step into the light, but nothing did. The absence was worse than any presence. It made my imagination run wild, filling the gaps with shapes I couldn't quite define. We set up our tents in a small clearing by the creek, the ground soft and damp under my knees. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and something sharper, almost metallic, like blood left to dry. I drove the tent stakes into the ground with more force than necessary, each strike a way to anchor myself against the growing dread. Mason didn't notice. He was too busy arranging his gear, his movements precise and confident. I envied his certainty, his ability to treat this place like just another adventure. To him, the forest was a playground. To me, it was starting to feel like a trap. As night fell, the fire became our only defense against the dark. I sat close to it, the heat stinging my face, and tried to focus on the small tasks: boiling water for noodles, checking the knots on my tent. But my eyes kept drifting to the tree line, where the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I remembered a story my granddad told about a hunter who'd wandered too far into these woods. They found his rifle, his pack, even his boots, but never his body. Like the ground opened up and took him. Granddad had said, his voice low and steady. I'd laughed it off as a kid, but now sitting in the heart of Fox Hollow, it didn't seem so funny. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. I was lying in my tent, the nylon walls glowing faintly from the dying embers outside. Mason was snoring in his tent, the sound loud and rhythmic, a stark contrast to the silence that had settled over the forest. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of the trees pressing in their branches, reaching for me like fingers. I lay still, my breath shallow, listening to the night. That's when I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves, deliberate and slow, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart lurched, slamming against my ribs. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it came again, closer this time, circling the edge of our camp. I sat up my sleeping bag, rustling against the ground, and reached for my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but the familiar shapes of our tents and the fire's glowing coals. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something harmless. But the steps didn't sound random. They had a rhythm, a purpose, like someone was pacing just out of sight, testing the edges of our little circle of light. I unzipped my tent an inch, just enough to peer out. The forest was still the trees standing like silent sentinels. But the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. I whispered Mason's name, my voice barely audible. His snoring stopped for a moment, then resumed, louder than before. I wanted to shake him awake, to make him hear what I was hearing, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The steps paused, and for a moment, the silence was so complete, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Then they started again closer, the leaves crunching under a weight that felt too heavy for any animal I could name. My mouth went dry. my tongue sticking to the roof. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles aching, and waited for something to step into the light. Nothing did, but the feeling of being watched was so strong, it made my skin crawl, like invisible eyes were boring into me from every direction. The forest didn't just watch us, it knew us. That's what I realized when I saw the sign nailed high on a poplar, its faded letters spelling out a warning that felt like it was meant for me alone. The morning after the footsteps, the air was thick with mist curling low over the ground like smoke. Mason was already up boiling water for coffee, his movements as casual as if we were camping in his backyard. I didn't tell him about the noises. I didn't know how to explain the dread that had settled into my chest, heavy as a stone. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. To him, the forest was just trees and dirt, nothing more. But I could feel it, a presence, ancient and patient, waiting for us to make a mistake. We packed up camp in silence, the mist clinging to our clothes, leaving them damp and heavy. The trail was barely a suggestion. Now a faint crease through the underbrush that forced us to duck under branches and step over roots. My boots sank into the soft earth, each step pulling at my legs, like the forest was trying to hold me back. Mason led the way, his pack bouncing against his shoulders, his voice cutting through the quiet as he pointed out landmarks, a twisted oak, a pile of stones that might have been a wall once. I followed my eyes, scanning the trees, half expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. Around midday, we reached a rocky bluff, the ground falling away into a steep gully below. The view was breathtaking, the forest stretching out like an endless sea of green, but it didn't feel welcoming. It felt like a challenge, like the land was daring us to go deeper. Mason dropped his pack and pulled out a protein bar, tearing into it with his teeth. I sat on a flat rock, my hands unsteady, as I unwrapped my own food. That's when I saw the sign high up on a poplar, its wood splintered and gray. The paint was so faded, it looked like it had been bleached by time, but I could still make out the words, "No return trail." Mason laughed when he saw it called it a prank, something kids nailed up to scare hikers. But his laugh sounded forced, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. I didn't laugh. The sign felt personal, like it had been placed there for us. My granddad's stories came flooding back, hunters who'd ignored warnings, who'd walked paths like this one and never came back. I wanted to turn around to tell Mason we should head back to the truck, but the words wouldn't come. He was already moving again, his boots crunching over the rocky ground, and I followed my heart, pounding in my chest. The trail grew steeper, the trees closing in until we were walking single file, the branches brushing against my face like cold fingers. Every step felt like a descent into something I couldn't name, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. We stopped to eat again, perched on the edge of the bluff. The gully below was dark, the trees so dense they seemed to swallow the light. I was halfway through my protein bar when I saw something moving between the trunks, pale and tall, gliding without a sound. My breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought it was an elk, its form lean and graceful, but then it stood upright, its arms dangling too long almost to its knees. Its head turned slowly, methodically, like it was counting the trees. When it tilted its face toward the sky, I saw its jaw split, the lower half dropping open in a way that defied nature. My stomach lurched, the protein bar falling from my hands, the wrapper tearing in two. I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the thing, my body frozen, as if it had pinned me in place with its gaze. It didn't have eyes. Not that I could see, but I felt it looking at me, its attention heavy and deliberate. Mason was still eating, oblivious, his back to the gully. I tried to speak, to tell him to look, but my throat was glued shut. The thing stepped behind a thicket of saplings and vanished, leaving only the echo of its presence in my mind. I sat there, my hands trembling, the taste of bile sharp in my mouth. When Mason finally noticed my face, he frowned, asked if I was sick. I nodded, unable to form words, and he let it drop. But the air had changed. The forest was no longer just watching, it was waiting. My mother's voice called my name from the darkness, soft and trembling, the same voice that used to soothe me when I was afraid of the dark. But this time, it wasn't her. It couldn't be. The forest had stolen her voice, and it was using it to pull me closer. The second night, we camped in a hollow so small our tents barely fit. The trees pressed in tight, their branches clawing at the sky, blotting out the stars. I didn't want a fire, not tonight. The light would only draw attention, and after what I'd seen on the bluff, I wanted to disappear into the dark. Mason argued, said a fire would keep animals away, but I could tell he was shaken too. His jokes were fewer, his movements less certain. We set up in silence, the only sound the rustle of nylon and the dull thud of stakes driven into the earth. I lay in my tent, my sleeping bag pulled tight around me, my flashlight clutched against my chest. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's hiding something. I counted the calls of a whippoorwill, each one sharp and fleeting, until they stopped altogether. The sudden absence was like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I stared at the tent's ceiling, the nylon glowing faintly from the moonlight, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the forest wasn't empty. It was alive, and it was watching us. Then it came a voice, lung and sapo, drifting out of the trees. At first, it was just a mumble, too faint to make out. But it grew clearer, and my heart stopped when I recognized it. Cowan. It said my name, spoken in my mother's voice, the same gentle tone she'd used when I was a child, scared of shadows in my room. My chest went hollow, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be her. She was miles away, safe in her house, not out here in this forgotten hollow. But the voice was so real, so perfect, down to the slight tremble in her vowels. I turned to wake Mason, my hand reaching for his sleeping bag, but it was empty, the nylon cold under my fingers. Panic surged through me, sharp and electric. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight fumbling in my grip, the beam jittering across the trees. I called Mason's name, my voice swallowed by the forest, barely reaching the nearest trunks. The air was thick, musty, pressing against my skin, like a living thing. I stood there, my heart hammering, waiting for a response. Then the voice came again, farther down the slope, calling my name with that same heartbreaking softness. Part of me wanted to run toward it, to find her, to believe she was out there waiting for me. But another part, deeper and older, kept me rooted to the spot, screaming that this was wrong, that the forest was playing a trick. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark. That's when I saw it, 20 yards away, half hidden behind a black oak. It stood tall, its skin slick and pale, stretched too tight over bones that didn't fit right. Its arms hung slack, fingers brushing the leaves, its chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. I couldn't see eyes, just smooth, featureless skin where a face should have been. My knees buckled the flashlight, shaking in my hand. It shifted, sliding sideways around the trunk, its shoulders twisting in a way no humans could. It moved with purpose, circling me patient, like it knew I was trapped. I stumbled back, my shin catching on a rock, the pain sharp but distant. The beam of my flashlight caught another shape, just a flicker of pale skin between the trees. There was more than one. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my mind screaming to run, to move, to do anything but stand there. The voices rose again. First, my mother's, then Mason's, then my own, all calling my name in a chorus that echoed through the hollow. Each one was a knife cutting through my resolve, pulling me toward the dark. I didn't think. I just ran. Running through Fox Hollow felt like running through a nightmare, the trees closing in the ground, shifting under my feet, the voices chasing me like hounds. I crashed through brambles, their thorns tearing at my skin, drawing blood that felt hot against the cold night air. My flashlight beam bobbed wildly, catching glimpses of trunks and branches that seemed to twist toward me, reaching out to pull me back. My heart was a hammer in my chest, each beat so loud it drowned out the voices calling my name. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I'd see them. Those pale, eyeless things, their long arms stretching toward me, their featureless faces tilted in my direction. The trail was gone, swallowed by the dark, but I kept moving my legs, burning my breath ragged in my throat. Branches whipped my face, leaving stinging welts. But I didn't care. All that mattered was getting out, reaching the service road, finding the truck. The forest seemed to fight me, the ground uneven roots rising up to trip me vines, tangling around my ankles. I stumbled, caught myself on a tree, the bark rough and damp under my palms. My flashlight slipped from my grip, rolling into the leaves, its beam cutting a useless arc through the dark. I didn't stop to pick it up. I couldn't afford to stop. The voices followed, weaving through the trees, now soft, now loud, calling my name in tones that weren't mine, weren't Mason's, weren't my mother's. They were wrong, warped, like something had taken their voices and twisted them into something else. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out, but they burrowed into my skull, relentless. My legs felt hollow, my muscles screaming, but I kept running, driven by a fear so primal, it felt like it was part of the forest itself. The air was thick, heavy, with that metallic tang, like blood and rust mixed together. It coated my tongue, made my throat burn. I don't know how long I ran. Time blurred the dark, folding in on itself, until it was just me and the trees and the voices. Then, through the haze, I saw it, the faint outline of the service road, the gravel glinting in the first light of dawn. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, the dirt cold and damp under my hands. I crawled forward, gasping, my chest heaving. The truck was there, parked where we'd left it. The gate still open, its rusted hinges glinting in the pale light. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door handle. I climbed inside, slammed the door, and locked it, my breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. The ranger found me, hours later, slumped in the driver's seat, my hands still gripping the wheel. He was a tall man, his face lined with years of working these woods, his eyes kind but wary. He asked where Mason was, and I could only shake my head, my throat too tight to speak. I didn't tell him about the voices, the sign, the things in the trees. He wouldn't have believed me, or maybe he would have, and that was worse. He drove me back to town, the truck's engine, a low hum against the silence of the forest. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at the trees, afraid of what I might see staring back. It was October, the leaves brittle and blood red, falling in slow spirals to choke the path ahead. I'd come here to escape the suffocating weight of my Uncle Randall's funeral, the murmured condolences, the way my mother's voice cracked when she asked if I was holding up okay. I wasn't. That's why I stood here in this forgotten corner of southern Missouri, staring into a forest that seemed to swallow light itself. Something about this place felt wrong, like it was waiting for me to step inside and never come out. I'd heard the stories about Jasper Bend since I was a kid, tales of loggers vanishing in the 1800s, their tools found scattered, but their bodies gone as if the earth had opened up and claimed them. Some blamed rock slides. Others whispered about things that didn't belong in daylight. I'd always dismissed them as old men's tales, the kind you tell over cheap whiskey at the VFW. But standing there, with the wind hissing through the pines, I felt a prickle at the base of my skull, like the forest was sizing me up. I was 29, too old to believe in ghost stories, but young enough to feel the ache of proving something to myself. After the funeral, I couldn't stay in my mother's house another night, surrounded by her worried glances and the smell of lemon polish from that brick church where we'd laid Randall to rest. I needed to be alone to let the quiet stitch me back together. So I'd packed light, a tarp, a sleeping bag, a couple of protein bars, a thermos of gas station coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, and my old hunting knife, its handle scratched with my initials from when I was 17. I'd chosen Jasper Bend because no one went there anymore. The trail was unmarked, overgrown a scar through the wilderness that maps pretended didn't exist. I'd heard about it in hushed tones, always, after a few drinks, always with a glance over the shoulder. Don't go too far in, they'd say. That place doesn't give people back. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped past a rusted gate hanging on one hinge, its metal warped, like it had been clawed by something desperate to get out. A wooden sign so weathered, the letters were just ghosts of grooves leaned against a tree. I squinted, tracing the faint outline of Jasper Bend with my finger, the wood cold and splintered under my touch. My chest tightened, a warning I ignored. I could have turned back, driven to town, slept in the guest room with its faded quilt and the hum of my mother's fridge. But the silence out here, it was different. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a presence, thick and heavy, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a choice. "You're here now?" it seemed to whisper. "Keep going." I slung my rucksack over my shoulder, the weight grounding me, and started down the trail. Each step felt like crossing a threshold, the world behind me, fading, until the gate was just a memory, swallowed by the trees. The path was barely a path, a narrow crease through brambles and fallen branches, the ground dipping into gullies where runoff had carved jagged scars. The air smelled of wet moss and something sharper, like iron, left to rust. I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for roots that snaked across the trail like traps. Every so often, the forest parted to reveal fragments of a forgotten world. A collapsed fence, its boards half buried in the dirt, as if the earth was trying to erase it. A pile of broken glass glinting in the weak sunlight, bottles shattered long ago. I wondered about the people who'd lived here, if they'd left, because they wanted to, or because something had driven them out. My boots sank into the soft earth, each step heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was reluctant to let me pass. The ridge loomed ahead, its outline jagged through the bare branches, and I felt a pull, not just forward, but inward, like the forest was curling around my thoughts, urging me to keep moving. About a mile in, I found a clearing no bigger than my old apartment's kitchen, ringed by stones that looked like the bones of a house long gone. In the center, a crooked sapling grew from a shallow pit, its roots clawing at the air. My mouth went dry, a sour taste coating my tongue. I didn't know why, but that sapling felt wrong, like it was feeding on something it shouldn't. I skirted the edge of the clearing, keeping my distance, my hand brushing the hilt of my knife for reassurance. The light was fading, the sun sinking behind the ridge, painting the trees in shades of ash and shadow. I told myself I'd camp soon, find a spot by the river where the ground was flat and the air less heavy. But as I moved on, the forest seemed to tighten around me, the branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the sky. You wanted solitude, I thought. This is it. But solitude wasn't supposed to feel like this, like something was watching, waiting for me to look away. The trail curved downward, the ground slick with silt, as I neared the river. It wasn't much of a river, more a trickle of water over smooth, pale rocks, glinting like teeth in the dying light. I found a flat spot under a bluff, the earth packed hard enough to feel solid under my boots. My prints stood out starkly in the damp soil, each one a small betrayal of my presence. I dropped my pack, the thud echoing louder than it should have, and set about building a fire. The routine grounded me, gathering twigs, stacking them in a careful pyramid, striking a match until the flames caught. The heat licked at my face, a fragile barrier against the chill creeping through my jacket. I sat close to the fire, my paperback in hand, the pages curling at the edges from years of being shoved into backpacks. I read the same paragraph over and over, the words blurring into nonsense. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, where the shadows seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing in time with the flames. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustle of small animals, just a stillness that pressed against my eardrums. I tried to focus on the fire, the way the logs cracked and shifted, but my skin prickled with the sense that something was just out of sight, waiting for me to blink. "You're tired," I told myself. "It's just the woods playing tricks." But then I saw them footprints, faint and smudged, trailing behind mine in the silt. They were narrow, too small for an adult, the toes splayed in a way that didn't look right. Some were spaced so far apart, it was as if whoever made them had been leaping their steps, defying gravity. My stomach twisted, a cold knit forming under my ribs. I crouched, my fingers hovering over the prints, afraid to touch them. They're old, I thought. Weeks old, maybe months. But the edges were too sharp, the dirt too soft, as if the rain from days ago had barely touched them. I stood my breath shallow and forced myself to keep moving. I added more wood to the fire, the flames flaring briefly before settling into a steady glow. The paperback lay forgotten on my pack as I scanned the darkness beyond the bluff. The river's faint trickle was the only sound, a thin thread in the suffocating quiet. I pulled out a protein bar, the wrapper crinkling too loudly in my hands, and chewed mechanically, the taste like cardboard mixed with regret. My eyes kept returning to those footprints, their shapes burned into my mind. I told myself they could belong to a kid, maybe a hiker's child, who'd wandered too far. But no one came out here. Not kids, not hikers, not anyone. The stories about Jasper Bend weren't just warnings, they were boundaries, lines drawn to keep people out. And I'd crossed them. Then it came, a low, deliberate whistle drifting down the slope, like a blade through the silence. It was too clean, too human. 2 notes, rising and falling, with a pause that felt like it was waiting for an answer. My breath caught my chest tightening as I gripped the knife at my belt. I waited, ears straining the fire's warmth, suddenly distant. The whistle came again, the same notes, the same pause, as if whoever made it was standing just beyond the light, listening. Call out, my mind urged. Say something. But my throat felt sealed shut. Hello? I finally managed my voice, thin and brittle, swallowed by the trees. Nothing answered. The silence that followed was worse, heavier, like the forest was holding its breath, daring me to move. I sat, frozen, the knife's handle, digging into my palm, my eyes locked on the darkness where the whistle had come from. I don't know how long I sat there, the fire burning down to coals, the air growing colder. The whistle didn't return, but the quiet felt alive watching me. I crawled into my tent, leaving the flap half unzipped, as if that would make a difference. I lay on my back, the knife across my chest, its weight a small anchor against the fear creeping up my spine. The fabric of the tent glowed faintly in the moonlight, each shadow outside magnified into something monstrous. My shoulders ached from tension. My jaw clenched so tight, my teeth hurt. I tried to close my eyes, to let the exhaustion pull me under. But every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, jerked me back to alertness. You're safe, I told myself. But the words felt hollow, like a lie I couldn't believe. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a presence, and I was an intruder in its domain. I must have drifted off at some point, because when I woke, my heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might crack my ribs. The tent was dark, the moonlight gone, leaving only the faint glow of embers outside. I lay still, my breath shallow, listening for what had pulled me from sleep. The air felt thick, pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, each step measured, as if whatever was out there didn't want to be heard, but couldn't help itself. It was close, maybe 10 feet from the tent, circling the edge of the bluff. My hand tightened on the knife, the blade cold against my skin. I waited, praying it would move on, that it was just an animal, a deer, a raccoon, anything normal. But the steps stopped right outside the tent, and the air grew heavier, like it was holding its breath with me. Then it came a single finger, tracing the nylon above my knee, slow and deliberate, as if testing the fabric's strength. My jaw locked, my teeth grinding together, the ache spreading to my temples. The finger moved again, following the curve of my leg. Its touch light, but certain, like it was mapping me out. I shut my eyes, my breath trapped in my chest, every muscle screaming to move, but paralyzed by fear. Don't look, I thought. If you look, It's real. The pressure lingered unhurried, as if whatever was out there had all the time in the world. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation. A branch caught in the wind, a trick of my imagination. But nothing fit. The touch was too precise, too intentional. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was here. The pressure lifted, and the steps moved away, fading into the trees with the same careful rhythm. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until the first gray light crept over the ridge, painting the tent in shades of ash. My hands were shaking unputly. I nearly dropped the knife as I crawled out. The campsite looked untouched. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove what I'd felt. But the air still carried that sewer-rotting smell, like wet fur, left to decay. I tore down the tent in minutes, my fingers fumbling with the straps, the tarp half folded in my haste. I didn't care about neatness, didn't care about the mess. I just needed to move, to put distance between me and this place. My pack was a tangle of cords and fabric, but I slung it over my shoulder and started walking, my head down, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Every step felt like a gamble, the trail narrowing as the trees pressed closer, their branches clawing at my arms. The forest was awake now, but not with the sounds of life. No birds, no insects, just the rustle of leaves that seemed to follow me, always just out of sight. My boots sank into the damp earth, each print a marker of my retreat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something slip between the trunks. A shadow, a shape, anything to confirm the terror clawing at my chest. The air grew colder, the smell of rot stronger, as if the forest itself was exhaling decay. I told myself I was almost there, that the trailhead couldn't be far, but the path seemed to stretch, the trees bending inward to block my way. I stopped, once my breath ragged, to check my bearings. The ridge was still visible, but it felt wrong, like it was watching me back. I fumbled for my thermos, the coffee cold and bitter, but it grounded me, gave my hands something to do. As I sipped, I noticed a flicker of movement, a leaf trembling when there was no wind, a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. My pulse hammered in my throat, my eyes scanning the trees for anything solid, anything I could name. You're imagining it, I told myself, but the lie felt thin like paper, stretched too tight. I kept moving faster, now the trail dipping into a gully where the air was so thick it clung to my skin. The forest wasn't just silent anymore. It was listening, waiting for me to make a mistake. The trailhead was closer now, the trees thinning, just enough to let slivers of light break through. My legs burned my shoulders, aching from the pack's weight. But I didn't slow down. The memory of that finger on the tent, the crunch of leaves, the whistle in the dark, they were anchors, pulling me forward, urging me to escape. I could see the rusted gate in the distance, its warped metal, a promise of safety, of the world beyond this cursed place. My truck waited there, a beacon of normalcy, its bumper glinting in the weak sunlight. Relief flooded me so sharp, it made my knees weak, but I didn't let myself stop. Not yet. Not until I was out. As I reached the clearing, my boots skidded on the gravel, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I dropped my pack, the thud echoing in the stillness, and leaned against the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. That's when I saw it, propped against the driver's side door, a strip of pale bark, its edges curled like it had been peeled fresh from a tree. Someone had carved a shape into it. Long legs, an oval head, no arms, just a blank silhouette that seemed to stare without eyes. My throat closed up, the air too thick to swallow. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, but stopped short, afraid to touch it. The carving was precise, deliberate, as if it had been made for me a message I wasn't meant to understand, but couldn't ignore. I looked around, my eyes darting to the tree line, expecting to see something step out. A figure, a shadow, anything to explain this. The forest was still the trees, standing like sentinels, their branches knitted together to block the sky. I could feel it, watching, waiting, as if Jasper Bend wasn't done with me yet. Get in the truck, my mind screamed. Go now. I grabbed the bark, its surface cold and slick, and shoved it into my pack, not knowing why, but unable to leave it behind. I climbed into the cab, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before they found the ignition. The engine roared to life, a sound so normal. It felt like a betrayal in this place. I backed up the tires, spitting gravel, and didn't look in the rear-view mirror until the trees were far behind. The road stretched out the forest, giving way to open fields, but the weight of Jasper Bend clung to me heavy as damp earth. I kept the bark in my pack, hidden under clothes I'd never wear again, but I could feel it there, a reminder of what I'd left behind, or what hadn't let me go. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my mother, not the friends who asked why I looked so pale when I got back to town. How could I explain it? The whistle, the footprints, the touch in the dark, the carving, they didn't belong in the world of coffee shops and gas stations. They belonged to Jasper Bend, to the shadows that lived there, to the silence that wasn't silent. at all. Sometimes, at night, when the house is too quiet, I hear it again, that low, deliberate whistle drifting through the walls. I don't sleep when it comes. I lie there, my hand on the knife I keep by the bed, waiting for the sound to fade. But it never does not completely. It's still out there in the dark, waiting for me to step back into its reach. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that silhouette carved into the bark, its blank face, watching its long legs ready to follow me home. The road stretched ahead like a scar through the blue ridge, its edges frayed with weeds that clawed at my tires, whispering secrets I wasn't ready to hear. I was 24 when Paige's voice crackled through my phone, brittle as autumn leaves, begging me to help her clear out her grandfather's cabin. She didn't say it outright, but I could hear the tremor in her words, the kind that comes from standing too close to something you know you shouldn't touch. The cabin was buried deep in a fold of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the trees grew so thick they seemed to choke out the sky. I'd grown up not far from there, in a town where the air always smelled faintly of pine and regret. But this place was different. It was the kind of nowhere you'd miss unless you were looking for it. And even then, you'd wish you hadn't found it. I didn't want to go. The thought of that cabin squatting alone in its clearing sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the October chill. But Paige was family, and family doesn't let you say no when the past comes calling. Her grandfather had died alone in that kitchen, his body left to rot until the mail piled up like a silent alarm. The sheriff had found him, slumped by the stove, a dark stain spreading across the linoleum like an accusation. Paige couldn't face it alone, and I couldn't let her try. So I said, yes, packed a flashlight and a pair of work gloves, and drove out before dawn, my truck rattling over roads that hadn't seen pavement in decades. The drive was a descent into silence. The highway gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track so narrow my mirrors brushed against the undergrowth. The trees loomed closer, with every mile their branches knitting together overhead until the sky was just a memory. My phone lost signal long before I saw the ruts of the logging track Paige had described. It wasn't a driveway. It was a wound in the earth, choked with brambles and broken branches that snapped under my tires. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles whitening as the forest pressed in its presence, heavy like eyes, watching from every shadow. By the time I reached the clearing, the cabin was waiting its sagging roof and splintered porch rail, lit by a sun too weak to warm the air. Paige's Corolla was already there, parked crookedly, like she'd been in a hurry to stop. She sat in the driver's seat, staring at the cabin as if it might stare back. I cut the engine and stepped out, the air sharp, with the scent of damp earth and something sour, like fruit, left to rot. "You brought a flashlight, right?" she asked, her voice tight, her eyes fixed on the cabin's dark windows. I nodded, patting the glove compartment where the flashlight lay, its weight a small comfort against the unease curling in my gut. We didn't speak as we climbed the porch steps, each one groaning under our weight. Like a warning, the door drifted open at my touch, as if it had been waiting for us. And the smell hit me like a physical force, mildew grease, and something older, heavier, like the breath of the house itself. Inside, the air was thick, clinging to my skin, like damp cloth. Dust coated everything, the sagging recliner in the corner, the folding table buried under newspapers and dented cans, the windows so grimy they turned the daylight gray. Paige pulled her t-shirt over her nose, her eyes watering. "God, it's worse than I thought," she muttered, her voice muffled. I didn't answer, just stepped forward, my boots leaving prints in the dust. The cabin felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. Its silence, not empty, but watchful, like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sent a jolt through me, as if the house was testing my resolve. I glanced at Paige, her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling as she stuffed papers into a trash bag. We were intruders here, and the cabin knew it. The kitchen was worse. The linoleum, curled at the edges, cracked like old skin. And there by the stove was the stain, a dark, uneven blotch that seemed to pulse in the dim light. I looked away, my stomach churning, and opened a cabinet to distract myself. Inside were boxes of cereal, so old the cardboard sagged, and glass jars filled with something that might have been food once, but now looked like sludge. I shut the door quickly, my fingers brushing against the rough wood, and moved to the hallway. Paige stayed in the living room, her movements mechanical, her eyes darting to the shadows every few seconds. I wanted to say something to ease her, but the words stuck in my throat, heavy as the air around us. The hallway led to a bedroom, its door half open, revealing shelves crammed with more jars. The labels were written in spidery script, okra, beans, peaches, but the contents were wrong, collapsed into gray mush that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. One jar caught my eye, a pale lump floating inside, curled like a fetus, or a creature caught mid-sleep. For a moment, I thought it moved a faint twitch against the glass, but when I blinked, it was still. My heart thudded a slow, heavy beat that echoed in my ears. I backed out, shutting the door, and told myself It was just the light playing tricks. But the cabin didn't feel like a place that played tricks. It felt like it was waiting to show me something worse. The cabin's silence wasn't empty. It was a presence heavy and deliberate, like a hand pressing against my chest, daring me to move. Paige and I worked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of trash bags and the occasional groan of the floorboards, each one a reminder that we weren't alone in this place. The living room was a maze of clutter stacks of yellowed newspapers, a knitting basket with yarn so faded it looked like ash, a clock on the mantel that had stopped years ago, its hands frozen at midnight. Every object felt like a relic, a piece of a life that had ended long before Paige's grandfather took his last breath. I tried to focus on the task, sorting through papers, boxing up chipped mugs, but my eyes kept drifting to the hallway, to that closed bedroom door where the jars waited. Paige was quieter than usual, her usual chatter replaced by a tense focus. She'd pause every few minutes, her head tilting as if she'd heard something I hadn't. "You okay?" I asked, once my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. She nodded, but her eyes flicked to the hallway, her lips pressed into a thin line. I followed her gaze, my skin prickling. The door was still closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind it, listening, waiting for us to make a mistake. I turned back to the kitchen, forcing myself to move faster, to fill the boxes and get out before the light failed. The kitchen was a graveyard of forgotten things. The cabinets held more jars, their contents murky and unidentifiable, the glass clouded with age. I found a stack of plates, their edges chipped, and packed them carefully, trying to ignore the stain on the floor. It wasn't just a mark. It was a presence, a reminder of the man who'd died here, alone, his life seeping into the linoleum. I kept my back to it, my hands moving mechanically, but every time I bent down, I felt it watching me, its edges creeping closer in my peripheral vision. I told myself it was just a stain, just blood, or coffee, or something spilled long ago. But my body didn't believe me. My pulse thrummed in my throat, steady and insistent, like a drum beat, calling me deeper into the house. I moved to the hallway again, needing to escape the kitchen's weight. The air was thicker here, heavy with the scent of mildew, and something sharper, like the tang of old metal. The bedroom door loomed at the end, its surface scarred with scratches that didn't look random. I reached for the knob, then stopped my hand hovering. Paige's voice broke the silence, sharp and sudden. "Don't go in there," she said. Her words clipped, her eyes wide. I turned, startled, and saw her standing in the living room, a trash bag dangling from her hand. "He never let me in there," she added softer, now, her voice trembling. "Said it wasn't safe. Not safe how I asked my hand, still inches from the knob." She shrugged, but her shoulders were rigid, her eyes locked on the door. I wanted to push, to ask what she meant, but the air felt too heavy, like it was pressing the words back into my throat. I stepped away, letting my hand fall, and went back to the kitchen. The jars in the bedroom stayed in my mind, their contents shifting in my memory, that pale lump twitching like it had a pulse. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the cabin wouldn't let me forget. Every creak, every shadow felt like a warning, a whisper that we were trespassing on something that didn't want us here. The afternoon dragged in the light outside, fading to a dull gray. The windows barely let it in, their panes smeared with years of neglect. Paige worked faster, now her movements jerky, like she was racing the dark. I felt it too, the way the cabin seemed to tighten around us as the sun sank. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m., and felt a knot form in my chest. We needed to finish before nightfall, before the forest swallowed the clearing whole. I hauled an armload of blankets outside, dumping them in a pile by the porch, their fabric damp and heavy with the smell of mold. Each trip back inside felt harder, like the cabin was pulling me back, reluctant to let me go. Paige glanced at the hallway again, her face pale. "What's in there?" I asked, keeping my voice low, as if the house might hear. She shook her head, her eyes distant. "He used to talk about things in the woods," she said, finally, her words barely audible. "Things that watched him. He said they came closer at night." I swallowed my mouth dry and tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat. The cabin didn't feel like a place for laughter. It felt like a place where stories like that were born, where the truth hid in the shadows, waiting for you to look too long. The cellar door gaped like a mouth, its hinges rusted and silent, exhaling a cold that sank into my bones. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, staring at the square of darkness where the cellar door hung open. Paige was still in the living room, her hands buried in a box of papers, but her eyes kept flicking to me, to the door, to the shadows beyond. "We need to check the cellar before it's dark," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She froze, her fingers tightening on the papers until they crinkled. "He never let me down there," she said, her voice so soft I barely caught it. "Said it wasn't safe." I tried to keep my tone light, but it came out strained. like I was forcing the words through a filter. Not safe. How? She didn't answer, just shrugged her shoulders, hunched, as if bracing for a blow. I wanted to let it go, to say we'd skip the cellar and leave, but something in me wouldn't budge. The cabin had been pulling me toward this moment since we arrived. Its silence, a lure, its shadows, a challenge. I gripped the flashlight, its weight cold and solid in my hand, and stepped toward the door. The hinges didn't creak. They were too rusted for that. But the air that spilled up from below was heavy, thick with the scent of wet fur and something sour like meat left too long in the sun. The stairs were steep, narrow, built from rough boards that felt soft under my boots, as if they might give way. Each step left a damp print, the wood drinking in the pressure of my weight. The beam of my flashlight wobbled, cutting through the dark in thin, unsteady slices. Halfway down, the smell hit me harder, a cloying mix of decay and something chemical, like formaldehyde gone bad. I breathed through my mouth, my chest tight, and kept going. The cellar floor was packed dirt, uneven and cold, stretching out into shadows the flashlight couldn't reach. In the center stood a wooden workbench, its surface scarred with shallow cuts, like someone had been carving their secrets into the grain. Iron hooks hung above it, swaying gently, as if something had brushed past them moments ago. I stepped closer, my boots sinking slightly into the dirt, and aimed the light at the far wall. Shelves lined it, crowded with more jars. Their glass yellowed the liquid inside a sickly amber. Things floated in them, shapes I couldn't name, too soft, too wrong to be plants or preserves. One held a coiled mass like intestines pressed against the glass. Another had something long and thin, its edges frayed like old cloth. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't look away. The beam lingered on a jar with a single pale finger, its nail black and curled, suspended in the liquid, like it was pointing at me. I took another step, my breath shallow, and felt the air shift heavy and deliberate, like the cellar was exhaling. Paige. I called my voice, echoing off the dirt walls, too loud, too desperate. No answer. My heart climbed into my throat, a slow, pounding rhythm that made my head swim. I turned back to the stairs, ready to climb out, when I heard footsteps above, slow and heavy pacing across the kitchen floor. Paige? I tried again, softer now, but the steps didn't stop. They moved toward the door, deliberate, measured like someone testing the boards for weakness. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles aching, and started up the stairs. Each step, a fight against the weight of the air. I was almost at the top when the door swung shut, the latch clicking with a finality that turned my blood to ice. "Hey!" I slammed my palm against the wood, the impact stinging my skin. Paige opened the door. Her voice came through, muffled and shaking. "Eloan, there's someone outside." My mouth went dry, the flashlight beam trembling across the door's grain. "What do you mean?" "Someone." I pressed my forehead to the wood, straining to hear. "He's standing in the trees." She whispered her words, barely reaching me. "He's watching me." My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. I hit the door again, harder, the wood rattling in its frame. "Just open the door." "Okay," I said, my voice cracking. Her footsteps moved away, faint and uneven, and then silence. I turned my back to the door and swept the flashlight across the cellar. The shadows seemed to shift, curling at the edges like smoke. Then I saw it, a shape unfolding from behind a stack of burlap sacks in the corner. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and thin, bending at angles that made my stomach lurch. Its skin was pale, slick, stretched tight over bones that didn't fit right. One arm reached out the elbow, snapping backward with a faint pop, and I stumbled back, my spine hitting the stairs. The thing raised its head, the flashlight catching a smooth expanse of flesh where a face should have been. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank mask that seemed to see me anyway. My breath came in sharp, broken gasps, the air too thick to fill my lungs. The thing crawled forward, its movements slow, deliberate, each shift making a soft, sucking sound against the dirt. I threw my shoulder against the door, the wood groaning, but holding fast. I hit it again, then again, my arm aching with the effort. On the third try, the frame splintered, and the door flew open, spilling me into the kitchen. Paige stood by the table, her eyes wide, staring past me into the cellar. "Where is he?" I gasped, scrambling to my feet. Her voice was flat, hollow. He walked back into the trees. The clearing outside was a trap, the trees a wall of shadows that hid eyes I couldn't see but felt in every nerve. I grabbed Paige's wrist, her skin cold under my fingers, and pulled her toward the porch. My boots skidded on the warped boards, the air sharp with the scent of pine and decay. The truck was still there, its outline barely visible in the fading light, a lifeline in the suffocating dark. I didn't look back, didn't dare. But the weight of the cellar followed me, its blank-faced thing etched into my mind like a burn. Paige stumbled behind me, her breath ragged, her hand trembling in mine. "Hurry," I hissed, my voice low, as if the trees might hear. We reached the truck, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly they slipped twice before I got the door open. Paige climbed in her movements, jerky, her eyes fixed on the tree line. I slammed my door shut, locked it, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a sound that felt like defiance against the silence of the clearing. I glanced at Paige, her face pale, her lips moving silently, as if praying or cursing. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, just pointed to the windshield, her finger trembling. I followed her gaze. Through the glass, the trees stood like sentinels, their trunks black against the dusk. Then I saw it, a shape slipping between the pines, tall and thin. Its movements, fluid, unnatural, like water poured over bones. It paused, half hidden, its head tilting as if it could see us through the glass. Paige let out a strangled sob, her hand clamping over her mouth. I stomped the gas, the truck lurching forward, gravel spitting under the tires. The ruts of the logging track jolted us, the wheel vibrating in my hands. But I didn't slow down. The forest seemed to close in branches, scraping the sides of the truck, their tips clawing at the windows like fingers. The rearview mirror was a mistake. I glanced at it once, just once, and saw them, dozens of shapes, tall and pale, standing at the edge of the clearing. They didn't move, didn't chase, just watched their outlines, sharp against the fading light. My stomach twisted, a cold knot that spread to my chest. I pressed the gas harder, the truck bouncing over roots and rocks, the engine's roar drowning out the thud of my heart. Paige was silent now, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes locked on the road ahead. The track seemed endless, its twists and turns, a maze designed to keep us trapped. But I kept driving my hands, gripping the wheel, until my knuckles ached. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open sky, and I felt a flicker of relief, fragile and fleeting. We hit pavement, the sudden smoothness jarring after the ruts, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The gas station in Darnell was the first sign of civilization, its neon lights buzzing like a beacon. I pulled in the truck, shuddering to a stop, and sat there, my hands still on the wheel, sweat cooling on my neck. Paige didn't move, didn't speak, just stared out the windshield. her face a mask of shock. "We're okay," I said, more to myself than to her. But the words felt hollow, like a lie. The cabin wouldn't let me believe. I turned off the engine, the silence rushing in heavy and oppressive. The forest was miles behind us, but I could still feel it, its weight lingering in my bones, its shadows clinging to my skin. I looked at Paige, her eyes red, her breath uneven. "What was it?" she whispered. Finally, her voice so soft, it barely reached me. I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was too big, too wrong to fit into words. The cabin hadn't just been a house. It had been a threshold, a place where the world we knew met something older, hungrier, something that had been waiting for us to step inside. We didn't go back. The boxes we'd packed, the blankets we'd piled outside the jars, with their unspeakable contents, they stayed where we left them. The cabin could keep its secrets, its stains, its shadows. I drove Paige home, the highway stretching out like a promise of safety. But every mile felt like a lie. The forest was behind us, but its reach was longer, its memory sharper. At night, when I close my eyes, I still see that blank face, its limbs bending, wrong, crawling toward me in the dark. And sometimes, in the quiet, I hear the cellar door creak open, its breath cold against my skin, whispering my name. The silence of the Blue Valley Range wasn't just quiet. It was a void, hungry and ancient, whispering my name before I even set foot on its trails. At 32, I stood at the edge of a life I no longer recognized. The city's hum, its endless chatter of traffic notifications and small talk, had worn me thin, like a blade ground too long against stone. I craved something raw, something that could strip away the noise and force me to face myself. That's why I chose the Blue Valley Range, a stretch of wilderness so remote it felt like the earth had forgotten it. No trails, no markers, just a labyrinth of ridges and hollows where the trees grew too tall and the shadows too deep. I'd camped for years, weekend escapes, week-long treks. But this was different. This was a test. A week alone off-grid, with nothing but my pack and my will to prove I could handle the weight of my own thoughts. I spent a month planning obsessive in a way I hadn't been since I was a kid, building model rockets. Every night, I'd spread topographic maps across my kitchen table, their creased lines glowing under the dim bulb. My finger traced forgotten forestry roads, streams that vanished into unnamed hollows, and ridges marked only by elevation lines. I found an old pamphlet at a ranger station, its cover warped showing a grainy photo of a crumbling cabin. Unrecorded hollows of the Blue Valley, it read, with sparse notes about abandoned settlements and trails that hadn't been walked in decades. It felt like a dare. I ordered a new tent waterproof to a fault and stocked up on batteries, a first aid kit, and a hand crank radio for emergencies. 3 knives overkill, maybe, but they felt like anchors. I called my brother Matt, keeping my voice light, saying I'd be gone 6 or 7 days. He laughed, called it a missing persons documentary in the making. I brushed it off, but a splinter of doubt lodged in my chest. The morning I left Dawn was still a bruise on the horizon. My Subaru sagged under the weight of gear sleeping bag, wedged behind the passenger seat, pack swallowing the trunk. The drive to East Wick Trace was a slow unraveling of civilization. Highways gave way to cracked asphalt, then gravel, then a dirt track barely wider than my car. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was just a gravel scrape. No sign, no marker, only a deer path vanishing into the trees. I sat in the driver's seat, engine ticking as it cooled, and felt the silence press against the windows. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air itself was waiting. I shouldered my pack, checked my compass, and stepped into the forest. The trees swallowed the road behind me before I'd gone 10 steps. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. 12 miles, maybe more, through a landscape that felt untouched by time. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, sharp enough to clear my head. I passed a crumbling chimney, its stones moss-covered, standing alone in a clearing like a forgotten sentinel. Rusted fence posts trailed off into the underbrush, their purpose long erased. Vines choked the path, forcing me to step carefully. But the solitude was a balm. No voices, no engines, just the rhythm of my boots on the earth. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge I'd marked on my map, a flat expanse tucked between 3 boulders. A stream ran nearby its water, clear over pale rocks. I set up camp in a natural bowl hidden from the world and felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in months. I built a fire ring with stones hauled from the creek, each one smooth and cold in my hands. The fire caught quickly, its warmth pushing back the chill as the sky darkened. I ate a pouch of freeze-dried stew, its taste like salted cardboard, and scribbled notes in my journal about the route. The quiet was profound, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch falling somewhere out of sight. I crawled into my tent, hand resting on the knife at my belt, not out of fear, but habit. The stars were sharp through the nylon, and for a moment, I felt like I'd found what I'd come for. But as I lay there, the silence shifted, It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence, thick and watchful. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches knitting together overhead. I told myself it was just the strangeness of being alone, my mind filling the void with shadows. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Somewhere in the distance, a single twig snapped deliberate and clear. My breath caught, and I waited, straining to hear it again. Nothing followed, just the weight of the night pressing down. The ground itself seemed to whisper secrets each step, unearthing a story I wasn't meant to hear. Morning came, with a thin mist curling over the ground, dusting everything in a ghostly white. I brewed coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and walked a slow circle around the campsite compass, in hand to anchor myself in the landscape. The ridge sloped into a narrow gully, its banks steep and tangled with roots. Something about it pulled at me, like a thread caught on a nail. I told myself I'd just scout the rise, but curiosity tugged harder than caution. After lunch, I packed light knife water notebook and followed the gully down nearly a mile, picking my way over fallen trees that lay like barricades. The deeper I went, the more the forest felt untouched. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying a faint, metallic tang. I found a rusted chain, half buried in leaves, its links pitted and cold. Farther on, a pile of bones caught my eye. Small, delicate, maybe a fox or raccoon, picked clean and scattered in a way that felt too orderly. I stopped, turning my head to listen, but the gully was silent, not even a bird stirring. My pulse quickened, though I couldn't say why. I kept moving, eyes scanning the underbrush, until I spotted it, a patch of freshly turned dirt, a wide, shallow mound that didn't belong. It wasn't a burrow, too broad, too deliberate. The earth looked disturbed, as if something had clawed its way out or been buried in haste. My neck prickled a crawling unease that made my skin feel too tight. I stepped back, telling myself it was nothing, an animal's den, maybe, or a storm's aftermath. But the shape of the mound stayed with me. Its edges too sharp, too intentional. I didn't touch it, didn't kneel to inspect it. Instead, I turned back toward camp, my steps quicker than before. The gully seemed to narrow as I climbed the trees, pressing closer, their branches clawing at the sky. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow move. Nothing did, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp cloth. Back at camp, I busied myself with routine sorting gear, checking the tent stakes, collecting more wood. The fire ring was still there, stones undisturbed, but the sight of it didn't calm me. I built a larger fire than the night before, dragging branches until my arms ached. The flames threw light across the clearing, painting the boulders in flickering gold. I sat with my back against one knees, drawn up, and tried to focus on the warmth. My journal lay open, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched the tree line, my eyes tracing the dark spaces between trunks. The night deepened, and the silence grew heavier, like a blanket I couldn't shake off. I fed the fire stick after stick, each snap of burning wood too loud in the stillness. My hands rested on my knees, the knife handle a familiar weight against my palm. I told myself I was fine, that the mound was just dirt, the silence just nature, but my body didn't believe me. My shoulders stayed tense, my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. Somewhere beyond the firelight, the forest felt alive, not with animals, but with something older, something that knew I was there. As the flames died to embers, I crawled into the tent, leaving the flap half unzipped. The moon was bright, its light spilling through the nylon, casting shadows of branches that looked like fingers. I lay on my back, knife across my chest, and tried to slow my breathing. Sleep came in fits, broken by the rustle of leaves or the distant crack of a branch. Each time, I held my breath, waiting for the sound to repeat, but the forest stayed silent, as if it were holding its breath too. My name spoken in the dead of night wasn't a sound. It was a hook sinking into my chest and pulling. I don't know what woke me. The moon was still high, its light sharp enough to etch every branch against the tent's fabric. My chest was tight, my heart thudding too fast, as if my body had sensed something my mind hadn't caught up to. I lay still, ears straining, until it came, a voice low and steady, saying my name. Not a shout, not a question, just a single word, spoken with calm certainty, like whoever it was stood just outside the tent, knowing exactly where I lay. My throat closed my breath, trapped behind my teeth. The air felt thick, pressing against my skin. I waited eyes wide for the voice to come again, but the silence that followed was worse heavy, deliberate, like the forest itself was listening. My mind scrambled for explanations, a dream, a trick of the wind, my brother's voice echoing from some old memory. But none of them fit. The voice had been too clear, too close, spoken with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. I didn't move. The knife's handle dug into my palm, grounding me, As I stared at the tent's ceiling, the shadows didn't shift, didn't betray any movement outside. But I felt it, a presence just beyond the nylon watching. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the world. I told myself to breathe, to think, but my body refused, locked in a stillness that felt like surrender. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The moon's light barely shifted, but dawn felt impossibly far away. When the first gray light crept through the trees, in short, jerking pulls, expecting footprints, broken branches, some sign I wasn't alone. The clearing was untouched, the fire ring cold, the ground smooth. I stepped out, knife still in hand, and turned a slow circle, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No scuffs in the dirt, no bent grass, just the same ridge I'd chosen for its shelter. My breath came easier, but the relief was thin, like a cracked window letting in a draft. I spent the morning distracting myself, boiling water, fishing in the stream, reorganizing my pack. Each task was a tether, a way to keep my hands busy and my mind from spiraling. But the voice lingered a weight in my chest that wouldn't lift. I kept glancing at the gully, half expecting to see the mound again, its dirt freshly turned. By noon, the sun was high, burning off the mist, but the forest felt no less oppressive. The trees stood too still, their shadows too sharp, like they were carved from something denser than wood. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was tired, that solitude was playing tricks on my mind. But as I sat by the stream, cleaning a fish with clumsy hands, the memory of my name spoken in the dark kept looping each repetition, tightening the knot in my gut. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The flames promised protection, but the darkness beyond them was patient, waiting for me to blink. By evening, the weight of the previous night had settled into my bones. I couldn't stay still, couldn't let the silence take hold again. I dragged every dry branch I could find to the fire ring, building a blaze so large it threw light halfway up the boulders. The heat stung my face, but I welcomed it, needing something to anchor me to the physical world. I sat against a boulder, knees drawn up, and watched the flames dance, their crackle drowning out the forest's quiet. My journal lay abandoned, its pages curling in the damp air. I couldn't bring myself to write, couldn't find words for the unease that had taken root. Instead, I counted the stars, traced the outlines of the trees, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that voice. My knife rested across my lap, its blade catching the firelight. I told myself I was in control, that the fire was a barrier, that nothing could cross it without me seeing. But the forest didn't care about my fire. It watched patient and unyielding from the shadows just beyond the light. I don't know when I dozed off. The fire was still burning, its embers glowing red when my eyes snapped open. The cold had seeped through my jacket, numbing my back against the boulder. For a moment, I thought the night had passed quietly. Then I heard it breathing slow and deliberate, coming from behind the boulder. Not animal, not erratic, but measured, like someone standing just out of sight, content to let me know they were there. My hands shook the knife, slipping in my grip. I stared at the fire's dying glow, willing my body to move. But my legs were lead, my breath shallow and useless. The breathing didn't falter, didn't speed up or slow down, just stayed steady, a rhythm that felt like it could outlast me. I couldn't look. The thought of turning my head, of seeing what stood behind me, was a wall I couldn't climb. My flashlight lay inches away, but reaching for it felt like inviting whatever was there to step closer. The night stretched on, the breathing a constant presence, unhurried and certain. I sat frozen eyes, locked on the embers, until the first gray light filtered through the trees. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the dawn breeze. I didn't move until the sun was fully up, its light washing the clearing in pale gold. When I finally stood, my legs trembled, and the knife fell to the dirt with a dull thud. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and I'd walked into it with open eyes. I broke camp in a frenzy, tearing down the tent with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The straps tangled, the stakes scattered, but I didn't care. I needed to move, to put distance between me and the ridge. The fire ring lay cold, its stones blackened, and I kicked dirt over it, as if that could erase the night. My pack was a mess, half zipped with gear spilling out, but I slung it over my shoulder and started walking. Compass, forgotten map, crumpled in my pocket. The trail felt different now, narrower, the trees crowding closer with every step. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my chest tight with a fear I couldn't name. I kept glancing behind me, sure I'd see a figure slip between the trunks, a shape, a shadow, something that knew my name. The gully loomed to my left, its banks steeper than I remembered. The mound's uneven shape burned into my mind. I didn't look at it, didn't dare, but its presence followed me, a weight dragging at my heels. Every sound was a threat, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the faint drip of water somewhere unseen. My boots caught on roots, my knees buckling with each misstep. I told myself to focus, to follow the slope downhill, that it would lead me to the road. But the forest seemed to shift the trees, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. My compass spun uselessly, the needle twitching like it was caught in a storm. I clutched it anyway, needing something to hold on to, even if it lied. I don't know how long I walked, hours, maybe the sun climbing and dipping without warning. My throat burned, my water bottle long empty, but I didn't stop to drink. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something sharper, like rusted iron. I kept moving, head down, until my boot slipped on wet leaves, and I stumbled to a halt. In the middle of the trail was a single boot print, larger than mine, by inches pressed deep into the soft earth. No other prints led to it, or away from it, as if it had been placed there deliberately, a message I couldn't read. My stomach dropped my vision, narrowing to that one mark. It wasn't human. Not quite. The edges were too sharp, the depth too even, like something had stood there, unmoving for hours. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs, and turned to run. The forest blurred around me, branches whipping my face, my pack slamming into my back. I didn't care. I just needed to reach the road, to see the sky unbroken by trees. The road was my salvation, but the forest wasn't done with me, not yet. The trail seemed to fight me, roots rising to trip my feet, branches clawing at my arms. My lungs burned, my legs trembling with every step, but I pushed forward, driven by a primal need to escape. The trees thinned, then thickened again, as if the forest were playing a game, teasing me with glimpses of freedom. My breath came in sobs, my vision swimming, but I kept running, the boot print seared into my mind. Finally, a strip of light broke through the trunks, pale and unsteady, like a mirage. I didn't trust it at first, didn't believe it was real, but I ran toward it anyway, my boots pounding the earth. The road appeared suddenly, a gravel scrape, exactly as I'd left it, my Subaru waiting like a lifeline. I stumbled into the clearing, nearly collapsing, my hands scraping the dirt as I caught myself. My pack slid off my shoulder, forgotten, as I fumbled for the keys. I locked the doors before I even sat down, my hands shaking so badly. The keys slipped twice before finding the ignition. The engine roared to life, a sound so normal, it felt out of place. I gripped the wheel, sweat stinging my eyes, and forced myself to look back. The tree line stood silent shadows, pooling between the trunks. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped, that the forest had let me go. Then something stepped into the open. A tall figure in a tattered canvas coat, dark stains streaking its front. It raised one arm slow and deliberate, pointing back into the woods. I didn't scream, didn't breathe. I slammed the gas, the tires spraying gravel as the car lurched forward. The rearview mirror showed nothing but empty road. But my gut told me the figure wasn't gone, that it was still there, just out of sight. I drove for 10 miles, the trees thinning into pasture land, before I let myself exhale. At a gas station in Darnell, under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights, I sat gripping the wheel, waiting for my hands to steady. The forest was behind me, but its weight stayed heavy and unyielding, like a shadow I'd never outrun. The Blue Valley Range didn't just take my courage. It left something behind, a mark I can't erase. Back in the city, the world felt wrong. The hum of traffic, the glow of screens, the chatter of strangers. It was all too loud, too bright, like a radio tuned to the wrong station. I didn't sleep for days, not properly. Every creak of the apartment floor, every flicker of a street light sent my heart racing. I kept my knife on the nightstand, its blade catching the glow of passing cars. My brother called once, asking how the trip went, but I couldn't find the words. Fine, I said, my voice flat, and he didn't push. I never opened the journal again. It sat in a drawer, its pages untouched, as if reading, it would summon the voice back. The topographic maps stayed folded, the pamphlet buried under a stack of bills. I tried to return to routine work, coffee, the gym, but the forest followed me. In quiet moments, I'd hear it again, my name spoken in that low, steady tone, clear as if someone stood behind me. I'd turn expecting nothing, but the emptiness was worse, a reminder that whatever I'd met out there wasn't bound by the trees. I haven't camped since. The gear sits in my closet, gathering dust, the tent still smelling faintly of pine. Sometimes I think about the boot print, the mound, the breathing behind the boulder. I wonder if it was waiting for me specifically, or if I was just another intruder in a place that didn't want to be found. I don't have answers, and I'm not sure I want them. The Blue Valley Range is still out there, its trails unmarked, its silence alive. And somewhere in its depths, something knows my name.